So I see people are starting to join, so I'll get started in just maybe another 30, 40 seconds, maybe a minute. So I just wanted to continue some of what I was saying earlier today in the Sikh Heritage Month panel discussion on the farmers' protest. There was a lot to say, and there was very little time to kind of complete my thoughts, and there's been a lot of interest in hearing a little bit more about some of the topics that I touched on. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the environmental impacts and the health impacts of the current modern farming techniques versus organic farming techniques that we had been used to for about 10,000 years. So when we talk about current farming techniques, I mentioned during the panel discussion the use of fertilizers, and we've become increasingly dependent upon the use of fertilizers in as far as growing our crops. And the problem with that is that first of all, it's the fertilizers that we use aren't very good for the soil. So the soil becomes deteriorated over time. Additionally, a lot of the nitrogen that is used in synthetic fertilizers, they run off into our water systems. They sink into the water table, they go into rivers, streams, and ultimately find their way into the oceans. And with nitrogen in the water, what happens is you get these algae blooms, and they utilize the nitrogen and form nitrous oxide. Now, nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas, which is about 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And so when that goes into the atmosphere, it's just worsening the greenhouse gas effect, and it's worsening the global climate crisis that we're experiencing today. In addition to that, we know that a lot of the pesticides that are used, they're not only designed to attack the nervous system of animals, but they're also many of them are also carcinogenic, and that's a fact. It's been it's been discovered through scientific research that is in fact true. These are neurotoxins. That's actually what they do. They're designed to affect the neurosystems of small animals. We don't get that affected acutely because we're much bigger. So bigger animals require higher doses. But what ends up happening is you see farm workers who might be exposed at much higher doses than normal consumers. They can have detrimental effects from this, and it's not that uncommon to see farm workers during the spraying seasons coming into the emergency departments to be treated for organophosphate poisoning. We also know that these organophosphates and other pesticides accumulate in our systems, in our tissue, within the body, and we know that these things can be carcinogenic. As a pathologist, part of what I do is diagnose cancer. That's what I do on a daily basis. I can tell you with certainty that our cancer rates are indeed increasing, but not only our cancer rates, but also rates of autoimmune diseases and endocrine dysfunction that we see as a result, in part at least, due to a lot of the pesticides that are being used on our food. Now, a lot of times you can wash your food very carefully. You can try to get as much of that pesticide residue off as possible, but there are some genetically modified organisms, GMOs, foods, where the actual cell of the plant produces the pesticide. And specifically, the most popular one, probably the most well-known one, is BT corn. So BT corn is genetically modified so that every single cell produces a compound it's known as BT, which is a type of bacterium that lives in the soil. And that bacterium produces a compound that is a pesticide. And so every cell of the BT corn plant produces this pesticide. You cannot wash it off. You can't get rid of it. If you're eating the corn, you are consuming this Bt. And we know that Bt has been found in high levels within the bloodstream of people, including pregnant people, and found in breast milk and things like that. So our infants are also drinking this when they feed. And certainly, as I was saying earlier, it's not that hard to, even though there might not be great scientific evidence that say, yes, this causes cancer at low concentrations or even medium or moderate concentrations, but it's not that hard to connect the dots when we know that we have increasing rates of cancer and various other diseases within our communities. And we certainly want to do everything we can to protect our health and protect that of the environment as well. With organic farming, we also move away from this idea of a monocrop farm. Modern farming techniques basically require that you plant one type of crop in a plot of land or in a farm, and that's the only crop that grows there. That's the only thing that grows there. And we use herbicides and pesticides to make sure that nothing else grows around it, just to maximize the yield of that plot of land. Now with organic farming or historical farming that we used for 10,000 years prior to conventional farming methods, we do know that it increases the biodiversity because plants are synergistic. And so when you sometimes you'll plant one crop with another type of crop, and they have synergy because one of them might naturally repel a certain type of pest, quote unquote pest, right? Or a small animal that might eat the other crop. And so there's a lot of knowledge that's been passed down over the last 10,000 years about agriculture, about farming. Farming communities who still rely on organic farming know a lot of this stuff. They understand which plants to plant next to each other to maybe repel some of the pests that might eat those crops. And it increases the biodiversity of that plot of land. And not only do some of the plants, not only are all the plants producing crop, but some of them will produce flowers that attract pollinators, and that's something we really need in agriculture. And it doesn't matter if you're using organic or modern farming techniques, we still need pollinators. And we know a lot of these pesticides are killing bees, they're killing butterflies, they're killing other pollinators. And so organic farming, which does not use these pesticides, don't use these chemicals that are designed to kill animals, we can plant plants that attract the pollinators and give them a natural environment, give them food to thrive, but in turn also cross-pollinate our plants, further increasing the biodiversity. When we talk about GMOs, there's a lot to be said about it. There's a lot to be said about how they came into use. Mexico is actually the first country to ever approve GMOs for consumption, but it's largely a product of the United States. And certainly the United States was one of the first countries to approve the consumption of GMOs. That happened in the mid-90s, but they had been patenting genes since the 1970s, the mid-70s. And it took about 15, 20 years to really come up with the first edible products that could be sold in stores in the mid-90s. Now, when that happened, the FDA approved it with very little scrutiny over the science that was provided by the agriculture companies, mainly Monsanto. That was one of the early companies that was providing genetically modified seeds for growth and for sale to customers. And the reason for that lack of scrutiny is predominantly because our political realms are highly controlled by corporations. Many of our political figures are not only puppets of corporations, but they actually come from those corporations themselves. So when you look at the FDA during the period that GMOs were up and coming and when they get approved, we see people working in the FDA in high levels who actually either came from companies like Monsanto, or they went to companies like Monsanto after they had approved genetically modified organisms for consumption and sale. We see the same thing happening when it comes to labeling of genetically modified foods. And so what has happened in the US is that they said, the government has said, well, and a genetically modified tomato looks like a tomato and it tastes like a tomato, so you don't have to label it as anything but a tomato. And so the onus of showing that a food was organically grown fell upon the organic producers. And so there are increasing costs there with organic producers that now they have to set themselves apart from the GMO companies, because the GMO companies don't have to provide additional labeling. So it's kind of a backwards way of thinking, but it's intended to make profit. And it's intended to do that, and it does that at the expense of the consumers, because they don't need to tell us what goes into those genetically modified foods. Now, genetically modified means that they have a patented gene that was developed by scientists, technologists, that has been introduced into a fruit or a vegetable or a crop that doesn't exist in nature. And so the company is able to put a patent on that gene and say, we own that gene. We own that seed, or the gene that's within that seed. And nobody else can reproduce it without obviously infringing on those ownership rights. Now, those genes don't naturally occur in those foods, right? So that's what makes it so weird. They take a gene sometimes from another plant, sometimes from another animal. So for example, they might be taking a gene from a fish or an insect and introducing it into a crop like a potato or a tomato. And it's because that gene gives a desired effect. It may repel a pest. It may allow more robust or growth in more robust conditions. It may require less water, or whatever the desired effect may be. But this is what genetically modified organisms are. Now, when the FDA did approve that for consumption in the United States to be sold in stores in the mid-90s, there were a number of FDA scientists who objected to that. And the reason why they objected was because they said this is something very novel. This is something very new. We've never experienced this before. We need more research. The research that's been provided by the agricultural corporations like Monsanto are not they're not complete enough. The science is not good. We need better science to show that these are in fact safe for consumption. And several of the FDA scientists got together and they actually signed off on a letter attesting to this, that they did not think that these foods would be ready. But of course, as I said, you had people who held high positions in the FDA that actually had close ties to Monsanto and other corporations who had actually worked for them. There were a number of litigation cases that went to the Supreme Court regarding genetically modified foods, and a couple of those cases were overseen by none other than Clarence Thomas, who was a Supreme Court justice at the time. And lo and behold, he was an ex-corporate lawyer for Monsanto in the 1970s. So once you start looking at this revolving door between corporations, corporate executives, corporate employees, and our government, political offices, it's not hard to see how a lot of this stuff gets pushed through. It's not in the best interest of the consumer, usually. It's usually in the best interest of the corporations that these things do get passed through. It's also important to remember that when it comes to genetically modified foods, I mentioned that it's very new, it's very novel. We're introducing genes in close proximity or in organisms that nature never intended, quote unquote, or has never experienced. When we meddled with food in the past, we used Mendelian genetics, right? We crossbred plants or animals or whatever it may be. We crossbred them in a way that they were already primed to accept those genes, to mix with genes, and it increased their biodiversity. And we were able to breed them to bring out characteristics and qualities that already existed, but now we could breed them in a way that it was beneficial to us. But those genes already existed. That's the big difference here. You don't have a gene from an insect being inserted into a corn plant or a potato plant. So it's very different. We don't really know what the biochemistry of that will be once it enters our bodies. A lot of that biochemistry depends on things like acidity, pH. It might be dependent on temperature. There's a lot of epigenetic factors that we really don't know what the downstream effects are when we combine genes like that. The science hasn't been thoroughly studied as it should be. There's a reason why the science hasn't been as thoroughly studied as it should be, and as I mentioned, it's because of corporate profits. Now, you might wonder, well, why doesn't somebody just do the research to do that? And that would be great if people could, and there are people who have done that. The problem is that these big corporations, not only in agriculture, but also in like dairy agriculture, meat agriculture, all kinds of different types of corporations, they have largely begun funding our academic institutions, so that when you have researchers that maybe 30, 40, 50 or more years ago would have relied on government grants to do the kind of research that they were doing at universities, now all of a sudden those grants are scarce. They're very hard to come by nowadays, and a lot of the research is being funded by the corporations. And so when you have corporate interests that are funding the research, once you start publishing science that's contrary to the best interest of those corporations, often the funding gets pulled. And so it's a conflict of interest for sure. Anyone who's gone to any scientific meetings knows that the very first thing a speaker has to do is to disclose their financial interests or any kind of the financial disclosures that they may have received money from any industry or corporation that may have been used in financing their research. Now, we know that it happens, when we accept that it happens, but for some reason, the culture has just become that we have accepted this and we don't question that this is a conflict of interest, when in fact it really is a conflict of interest. So the other problem that researchers have fallen into, and there are a few researchers who have been very outspoken against genetically modified organisms, against the seed, that have done research, which their conclusions have been that genetically modified foods are not fit for consumption. They're largely banned from publishing in scientific journals, and part of the reason why that happens is that these corporations like Monsanto, again, they actually have put people on editorial boards, their own people on editorial boards for very big scientific journals like Science and Nature. And so it becomes very difficult for independent researchers to try to publish their findings in a lot of the big scientific journals nowadays when it goes against corporate interests. Now, I'm not saying that we know for a fact that GMO foods are bad for you and you shouldn't eat them. I'm just saying that more research is needed, but it's almost impossible to really get that unbiased research nowadays. Too much time has passed, and there's a lot of corporate control over a lot of aspects of how that might happen. But with that said, we do know that companies like Monsanto, which is now 120 years old, it's a chemical company that's been around since 1901. They have a long track record of lying about their products and hiding research that showed that their products were detrimental to human beings. One such thing was DDT, used in the 1960s when farmers were using it to control pests. We used it to control mosquitoes, to kill mosquitoes and other insects. And they claimed that it was perfectly safe, but they in fact knew at the time that it was being used publicly that in fact was associated with cancer. And this was discovered through independent research at the time. A woman by the name of Rachel Carlson published a book in 1962 called Silent Spring. You may have heard of it. Silent Spring basically described the idea that come spring, there were no birds, there were no butterflies, there were no bees. A lot of the small animals had died off, and it was due to DDT and a related chemical called dioxin. We found dioxin in high levels in people's blood at the time. And so people discovered that this was indeed causing cancer, and eventually it was pulled from the market. This was something that Monsanto decided that they were going to try to do over and over again. This is something a lot of corporations do. They just see it as the cost of doing business. So they know that some of their products are not fit for human exposure or consumption, but they set aside the money to pay the fines for when they get caught. And it's no different than what a lot of other car companies and big banks do nowadays. They know that these quote-unquote white-collar crimes basically go unpunished as far as individual accountability. And what they do is they hold the companies accountable by implementing big fines. And the companies are okay with that. They're perfectly happy paying the fines later on because they made a lot of money in the meantime. So Monsanto has a long history of this. They did it with Agent Orange, which was a defoliant used in Vietnam by American troops. They would spray it over the forest, and it would cause the leaves to fall, exposing the quote-unquote enemy to American troops. About 4 million Vietnamese were exposed to Agent Orange, and about 3 million of those people developed severe illnesses related to cancer and other diseases as well. Many American troops coming back from Vietnam also developed cancer within the next 5 to 10 years after returning from Vietnam. And after their exposure to Agent Orange. We now know that this is a cancer-causing agent. We also know that Monsanto knew that at the time that it was being used in Vietnam, and that they hid that from not only the general public, but from the agencies which approved the chemicals for use. So my point being that we cannot trust these corporations to have our best interests at heart. We should absolutely question them when new products come about. We need robust scientific experimentation to make sure that these are in fact safe for human consumption and exposure. So with that said, like I said, a lot of these chemicals and things, they build up in our tissue, they build up in our blood, they're making us sick. They really are. And so we need a new paradigm, is what I'm getting at here. We need to move away, from the what's been called conventional, although there's nothing conventional about it, but modern farming techniques. Conventional farming is actually organic farming, because that's what we did for 10,000 years prior to the 1950s and 60s. So modern farming techniques, they're terrible for us, they're terrible for the environment, and they're terrible for the land. And so organic farming is really a way that we can move out of not only the environmental and health deterioration that we're experiencing, but also move into economic paradigms that are reflective of our values of social justice, environmental justice, racial justice, such things, gender inequities, things like that, that really have a lot of the values that I know people today hold. We don't want to be a slave to those corporate interests. And as I mentioned during the panel discussion, as was mentioned, we know that conventional farmers or modern day farming techniques are basically driving farmers into debt. We're going back to a feudal system of land ownership where people are losing their land to big corporations, but then they still work the land as farmers. And this is very much a step in the wrong direction as far as agricultural independence and sovereignty for people. So what can we do? Well, I mentioned during the panel discussion that, we really have a lot of power, and we really need to come into that power. We need to recognize it. We need to understand it. As consumers, we can certainly make choices when we go to the grocery store and understand that every dollar we spend is a vote. And if we think of it that way, are we going to vote for the big corporations that continue to poison us, poison our rivers, poison our forests, poison the land? Are we going to vote for organic farmers who are using no pesticides, using no artificial fertilizers, and they're creating biodiversity in our environments? They're protecting the soil from erosion. They're protecting our lands from desertification, and they're protecting our health. So we have a choice when we go to the grocery store. Who are we going to vote for? And a lot of people argue, well, organic produce is just too expensive. And that's true. Organic produce is expensive. When you compare it to the modern farming techniques used to produce produce, there's no doubt about that. But there are a couple of reasons why they are more expensive. One is that consolidation of land creates basically economy to scale. And so when you can farm a bigger piece of land, it's cheaper per acre or per meter than farming a smaller piece of land because of all the inputs that you have to pay for that go into it. So there's economy of scale, but that doesn't really account for everything. And so most of that accounts for the idea of what I alluded to earlier, that GMO foods in Canada and the United States are not required to be labeled as such. There's no such requirement. And so the onus of trying to differentiate non-genetically modified seed and produce from genetically modified falls on the organic farmers. Organic also kind of depends on what your country's definition of organic is, but generally speaking, it means no pesticides, no artificial fertilizers, no GMO. And there may be other requirements as well. But generally speaking, organic means not GMO and no chemicals. That's certainly what it means in Canada and the United States. But to label products as such falls on the organic farmers. The onus is on them. And so now you have extra costs. And it's actually quite costly to become certified, to have your farm certified as organic, and then to produce the labeling that points out to consumers that our products are organic. So we've actually done this completely backwards, where the big corporations came in with something entirely different, entirely novel, that the government said, well, it looks like a tomato, it tastes like a tomato, so it's a tomato. You don't need to label it as anything different. But at the same time, those same companies and the same government said, well, they're allowed to hold a patent on that. And so it's definitely hypocrisy at its finest, but we accept it and we don't fight it. We don't, there's no uprising against it really, except on a small scale. But some things we can do, as I mentioned, buying organic supports those farmers. And the other reason why the organic produce is often more expensive is not just because of certification and labeling, but it's because the large farms using modern farming techniques with chemicals, they get large subsidies from the government. So our tax money is actually used to grow food, which is not as healthy for us. Not only is it not as healthy, but it doesn't taste as good. The vitamin and mineral content is usually lower. And those crops are designed to grow big in close quarters and to survive travel long distances. And organic produce is not really designed to do that. So yes, the money you're going to input into buying organic produce is more, but once culture begins to change, we will also see prices start to drop. We'll start to see some equity there. And in addition to that, don't think that you're not paying for it, because we are paying the added cost of healthcare. We're paying, when we get sick, when we get cancer, when we get autoimmune diseases, we do pay for that. We just don't connect the dots very well. And so, when we think long-term sustainability, we really should be thinking organic produce, because that's how we're going to stay healthy, and the healthcare costs will start to come down, and other costs. We won't be subsidizing the big corporations, which actually don't need the subsidies. They're already super wealthy. And maybe we can start to vote for people into office, into political office, who are going to pass those policies that allow us to bring subsidies to organic farmers, to the small farmers. So that's the other power that we have. One is the power of our dollar. The other is the power of our vote. When we want to vote for somebody, to assume that we're going to vote for them and then change their minds is complete folly. But we've been convinced that that's what we can do. That's what the corporate media tells us that we can do. But in fact, it never works. It never has worked. It's been decades now that we've been seeing it doesn't work. So what we can do is make politicians make us promises before we vote for them. We withhold our vote until they say, yes, we're on your side, and we're gonna make the conventional or the modern farming techniques, we're going to make them label their products as GMO, and we're going to start giving subsidies to the small farmers and the organic farmers who are making healthier food for our communities. The other important thing I want to mention is just this community outreach of small farmers and organic farmers. When we go to a farmer's market, what is happening there is that you have a farmer who wants to sell his or her produce, and they sell it directly to consumers. As a consumer, I can go directly to the farmer. I can look at their products. I can ask them about how their products were grown. I can know everything about them. I can get to know them, know my food growers, and then I can decide whether I want to buy that product or not. And it's a really, really great way of doing business. You know, earlier in the chat, somebody had asked, well, who's going to set up these farmers markets? And that's the beauty of a farmers market. You don't need anybody else. All you need is yourself and the farmer. And both of you, it's a mutual deal. It's a mutual interest that you have in knowing your farmer. And your farmer, I guarantee you, these small farmers, these organic farmers, they have a vested interest in knowing their community and who's buying their produce. So it's a really, really wonderful success story that we've seen across North America. Farmers markets, it's certainly not big enough, but it's a growing trend. It's been growing rapidly for the last 10, 15, 20 years. And it's actually worked really well in a lot of communities. That's one way that we can actually really fight back against large corporations. They hate farmers markets. They don't want to see them happen, you know, because they have a vested interest in profits. And the middlemen, the distributors, the large chain grocery stores, they have vested interests in profits as well. They don't want to see you cut them out of the equation. But if we're doing it for our own health, if we're doing it for our environment, then it's a worthwhile cause, it's worthy, and it supports our farmers. You know, for the Kisan Morcha, you know, one of the logos, one of the things we see on the stickers and the flags is we support farmers. Well, we need to start asking ourselves, how do we support farmers? Do we just support them in name? Do we just say that, yeah, we think it's great that they are on the border of Delhi, and we think they have a right to protest, and we're going to support that? That's important, don't get me wrong. But it's also really important that we show them that we support them. And how are we going to show farmers that we actually support them and that they're an important part of our community? We're going to go out and buy their products. We're going to ask them about their products. We're going to interact with them. We're going to engage with our farmers and really start to get to know them and understand how this is beneficial for not just our health, our environment, but our communities. This is how we will come together as a community. So I just want to kind of wrap up here a little bit, and I'd like to give two examples of some resistance that I've seen in farming that are really inspiring to me, at least. The first is a woman by the name of Bibi Pritam Kaur Kher, and she came from India, from Punjab in 1975. She was relatively uneducated. She didn't speak any English, and she began working on farms picking berries. And they were paid very low wages. They didn't even have washrooms to go to, to use. And after a while, a group of women came to her and began speaking about the sexual harassment that they were feeling on the job, on the work site. And when Pritam Kaur approached the landowner, he actually held her at gunpoint. He pulled a gun on her and told her that this was none of her business. And she was eventually fired. Well, she didn't take that sitting down. So this uneducated woman, who is already 50 years old when she came to the U.S., basically fought to get her job back. And so she got her job back, and then she began organizing. She began organizing to demand higher wages, better working conditions, to make sure that women were no longer harassed on the work site. And she was actually quite successful, and she managed to unionize about 200 farm workers. And eventually, her career took her to become the vice president of the Canadian Farm Workers Union. And so a really, really impressive, inspirational woman who can really teach us a lot about ourselves. You know, these revolutions, they start with one person. And, you know, this is a woman who immigrated from Punjab to Vancouver. You know, this was in Canada that this happened. And so it's really, really impressive to see that one person can start a revolution. Guru Nanak Sahib was one man. He started an amazing, incredible revolution that's flourishing 500 years later. And so if we've learned nothing from our gurus, if we've learned nothing from our history, it's really that one person can make a difference. So we don't actually need, you know, all the fundraising and all the organizations. Those are great, and they certainly have a role to play. I'm not trying to knock them down, but you don't have to have that. There are many, many ways that you can cause a one-woman or one-man revolution and really change things up, shake things up wherever you are. The other example I want to give you is many of you will remember in 2010, there was a very big earthquake in Haiti that was very disruptive. It destroyed a lot of their infrastructure. It destroyed a lot of their systems. Their entire food chain was disrupted. People were going hungry. And they received a lot of aid globally. And many of you may have even volunteered to go there and help out and feed people. There were certainly Sikh groups that had gone and served langar to very hungry Haitians. Well, at that time, while Haitians were starving and their entire food chain had been disrupted, Monsanto came to the Haitian government and said, we want to donate food to the Haitians. And the government agreed. They said, this is a great idea. We'd love to see you do it. So Monsanto came in and they gave bags of genetically modified seed. I believe it was corn. Don't quote me on that. And the farmers from Haiti took these bags of seed and they piled them up. It was about 475 tons of genetically modified seed. And the farmers joined together and they burned all of that seed. They burned it because they did not want it in their country. And in fact, they referred to it as poison seed because they knew that once they start implementing genetically modified seed into their farms, they would become slaves to the corporations. They would do exactly what's happened in all the other countries in the world that have undergone the quote-unquote green revolution, which is they become a slave to the chemicals that have to go on the land in the form of fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. And so they burned that seed that could have fed their hungry brothers and sisters. It could have fed the entire country, but they decided that this was a bad idea for sustainability, for how to farm in the future. They knew it. They knew it inherently. They may not have been very educated, but they certainly weren't stupid. And they knew exactly what Monsanto was trying to do. They knew exactly what these corporations were all about. And so this was a resounding success story, even though they were turning down food. But in the long run, they knew that this was going to protect their communities, protect their country from corporate takeover, from the enslavement that ensues under the corporate farming system. So, in conclusion, I'd just like to share with you my favorite Sakhi of our gurus, something that's always inspired me. And this is the Sakhi of when Bhai Ji, before he was Guru Angad Dev Ji, Bhai Ji decided that he was going to move to Kartarpur to be with Guru Nanak Sahib permanently. He decided that's what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. And so he packed up his bags and he went to Kartarpur, and he shows up and he's wearing nice clothes. He wanted to look nice for the Guru. And he shows up at Guru Nanak Sahib's residence, and Mata Sulakshmi Ji greets him and says, well, Guru Sahib is not at home right now. He's out in the fields working. And so Bhai Ji says, well, can you point me in the direction that he might be. And so she points him in the right direction. He says he's out in the fields there. And so Bhai Lehna Ji drops his belongings and heads out into the fields, and he finds Guru Nanak Sahib. And Guru Nanak Sahib is working the land. He's planting crops, he's harvesting crops, he's, very, very in tune with what he's doing. And so Bhai Lehna Ji quietly joins him. He begins working alongside him. Whatever work Guru Nanak Sahib tells him to do, he does it. And at the end of the day, after many hours of working in the fields, Mata Sulakhani Ji sees Guru Sahib and Bhai Lehna Ji returning in the evening time. And she sees Bhai Lehna Ji is carrying a bundle of crops on his head. And the mud and the dirt are all dripping down him. His dastar is all soiled and muddy. He's got dirt all over his face. It's in his dadi. All his clothes are completely covered in mud and dirt. He's covered from head to toe in mud and dirt, completely soiled. And when they come close, Mataji chides Guru Nanak Sahib. She says, look what you've done. You've ruined his clothes. He came here wearing such nice clothes, and now you've soiled his clothes. You made him dirty. Why did you do that? And Guru Sahib looks at Bhai Lehna Ji, and he looks him up and down. And then he turns to Mataji and he says, I don't see soiled clothes. I don't see anything that's soiled. When I look at Bhai Sahib, all I see is that he's covered in saffron, in kesar. He looks beautiful to me. And so it's this idea that looking beautiful to our Guru is something very different than what we see in society, what we hear about on TV, movies, magazines, whatever it may be, internet, social media. But it was also this idea to me of this connection between Guru and Sikh, but also that connection with the land as well. Because Guru Sahib and Bhai Lehna Ji were doing this honest labor. They were working in the land. They were one with the land. And so that really speaks to me about how these things are all interconnected. We're all interconnected. Okay, people, communities, our environment, our land. And so it's not something different. Interacting with each other with love is no different than interacting with your environment with love, interacting with the land with love. And that's really what I want to drive home here, is that our current farming methods are not an act of love. It's not a relationship of love that we have with the land, with our environment, and with each other. And so if we want to foster that, we really have to rethink our paradigms, because those 3 laws that Indian farmers are fighting today, they could change tomorrow. But those farmers will still find themselves in the same predicament they were in before those laws were passed. They're still at the mercy of these corporations who will do anything. They're ruthless. They'll do anything to get those profits. Even if it means driving farmers into debt, even if it means watching them kill themselves and kill each other over that land. And so this is what I want to leave you with, is that we really need to rethink our paradigms about food. We really need to rethink our paradigms about agriculture and how we support corporations and what we can do in our own lives to make sure that we're supporting ethical methods of production of food. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.